Welcome, everyone, to this latest episode of the Life Itself podcast. And it is the second in a series of dialogues with Dr. Jeffery Martin. Jeffery is a founder of the Transformative Technology space, a serial entrepreneur, and a social scientist who researches personal transformation and the states of greatest human well-being, which he has been doing for more than 15 years now. You can find all episodes of this series on our website at lifeitself.org/podcasts. Well, first, welcome back, Jeffery. Thank you for joining me again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, really welcome. Now, for our listeners, last time, what we covered was first how you, Jeffery, came to this work, the empirical research on people who are kind of off the charts on well-being, what you and colleagues have termed fundamental well-being, or more academically, persistent non-symbolic experience, and what you learned from that. And then where we were ending, and where we may start up again a bit today, was that out of this research on the kind of people, the individuals you'd encountered, you became interested in creating a protocol for a kind of a course or a protocol for seeing if this could be facilitated or supported in people who had not transitioned already. And we talked a little bit about that. And to summarize, I think this extraordinary and incredible and wonderful result, which was that in this first effort at this, you got really, 70% of people, or certainly a majority of people, were transitioning during the program. Ordinary people who hadn't necessarily particularly had any prior, predilection, if you like, to this, were transitioning to fundamental well-being. And I wanted to ask then, to start out today, first of all, you said this was obviously a bit, was this surprising to you at the time?
It was.
Maybe not now, but then.
Right. Now it's normal, right? We just take it for granted, frankly. But then it was like a huge deal. I remember when we did our first group of 6 people, one of which dropped out, and the other 5 stayed in. And the first person transitioned somewhere in the program. I don't really remember where after all these years, but, maybe halfway through or something like that. And I just didn't believe her. It just didn't seem possible. I'd set this whole thing up for like this longitudinal 2-year data collection effort and all of that, but I would have captured a lot more data during that initial 6-person group if I thought that was going to happen. And so, and then another one did, and another one did. And I just wound up just grilling these people, because I just didn't believe that it had happened. And my assumption was, okay, they're misinterpreting something. Let's find out what that was. But eventually, I just had to accept that it actually happened, and it just blew my mind.
Wow. And so just in terms of, to give people a flavor, who probably haven't done the course or know, what was in the original, what you called the Finders Protocol? What kind of things, just to give an idea? It was a 4-month thing. Yeah, what kind of practices, or what did people do?
Yeah, that's a great question. It originally stemmed from our interviews with people, frankly, where they were asked what they did, actually their intake form more than the interviews, but that whole interview sort of time frame where we had a more extensive intake form for people. So it really kind of stemmed from this intake form. And on that intake form, it turned out that there were only a few things that people really said worked for them. And that of those things, quite a few people had done more than one, and yet they were only reporting one. And so one might work for you, but not someone else. And it was a very instructive thing, because we were able to basically see that there was maybe only a handful of methods that rose to the top, but just knowing those methods wasn't enough. You also had to sort of systematically engage with them. And of course, we went from there to experimenting with order effects, to experimenting with tweaking and changing the methods, based on, more up-to-date science and knowledge of human consciousness and brains and, all of that. And so by the time, and all of that had happened in kind of a onesie-twosie way in the research before these first groups, before the first sort of official finder's course experiments began. So we had, refined an order of things. We had figured out some very important things, like that some of the things that rose to the top of the research dark-nighted people, meaning they produced prolonged, very negative, even like suicidal level, emotional experiences for people. Obviously, can't do much with those in a university research environment, right? Because you're obligated as a scientist to put the health of your subjects above everything else, including the psychological health of your subjects above everything else. And so we had to deal with some of that stuff to figure out, could we even keep those methods in the protocol? And we wound up discovering interesting things about the dark night stuff, like a lot of it related to how depressed or how basically unhappy someone was before they used those methods. It also depended upon whether or not somebody had had a negative experience with, sort of a negative peak experience, either a negative drug experience or a negative just normal peak experience, or even a negative near-death experience, whatever, anything that's sort of in that classification of peak experiences. We don't think about the fact that people, some people go to hell when they have a near-death experience, right? Like the books are published and all of this white light stuff, oh, there's the tunnel of light and, oh, we're going through it. But, the Christian media, especially the more fundamentalist Christian media, they've got, they found plenty of people, and they've got plenty of books and stuff out there around people who went to hell, not sort of these heavenly type of experiences. And so near-death experiences can be very traumatic, negative experiences. We all know drug experiences, psychedelic experiences can be quote unquote bad trips, right? Those are notorious. And what people also don't realize is that, peak experiences can be negative. And so we think of, oh, I was standing on this mountain looking at this beautiful vista, and all of a sudden I was just one with everything and I felt blah, 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 right? And so that's the standard view of these things. But they can also be hellish and really just throw people into a very dark place. So the human brain and its ability to sort of do all of these different things has to be taken into account with a protocol like this. And it became clear that that was a good idea to have people as happy as they could be before they made it to these sort of gold standard methods. And also that it was important to try to give them a positive glimpse of fundamental well-being, even if just temporary, before they got to sort of the more hardcore methods in the program. And so as a result of that, it wasn't just the methods that were discovered from the research with the participants, but it was also an equal amount of time actually that was added to the beginning just to mitigate the potential negative emotional effects that could come by people using some of those techniques. And that alone took a year to figure out. It sounds simple now when I say it, right? But, if you don't have any idea what's causing that stuff, it turns out to take a long time to try to figure that out. So, and then verify it and make sure that that is the case and whatnot. And so by the time we made it to that first group of 6, basically, we had about a 12-week protocol that we were initially planning on. And the first part of that protocol was designed to deal with the dark night stuff. The first 6 weeks was solely designed to try to get people into a direction psychologically where when they used the methods in the second 6 weeks, they weren't going to have these dark night, or at least they were greatly reduced chances of having these dark night experiences. And that's worked very well, knock on wood. I don't want to jinx it or anything like that, right? Just sitting here on this podcast. But that has worked very, very well over the years. I remember maybe 2 or 3 years ago checking in with our clinical staff because some paper we were publishing, the editors asked us, and I said, hey, I just want to verify with you guys that we haven't ever seen any severe psychologically adverse events during these protocol runs. And they were like, yeah, haven't seen that. And so that was really good. And so if you think about this protocol, you have to realize that initially half of it was just designed to avoid dark nights. And then the other half of it was actually the methods that were designed to help people reach fundamental well-being. But it actually turned out that some of these methods that were designed to help people to mitigate dark nights wound up actually transitioning them. And so there were methods that were then put into the program that didn't actually rise to the top of the research. In fact, what they rose to the top of the research in was giving people a temporary glimpse of fundamental well-being very reliably. And we then sort of use those in conjunction with other things to make that a positive glimpse, be more assured than any sort of negative glimpse. So they would start off. Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just to ask a couple of things also for if I'm in the listeners? So one, just you're using this phrase, I think, dark night, just for people listening. What you mean is that you're shortening dark night of the soul, which in the Christian tradition or other is a classic description, which is that in mystical experience or something else, that you actually rather than feeling, let's say, God's love, you feel in fact the opposite, completely abandoned or in suffering. So first of all, just what you're saying that I think is really interesting is to say that these quite powerful methods, in a way, I like to think of it, I don't know how to put it, it's what you're saying is other things can influence in a way the way that goes, and that one of the risks that you'd identified from the intake stuff and other things was that the powerful methods could sometimes actually cause that. But what I particularly wanted to ask you was, can you give a concrete example of what these methods, just one example maybe of what the kind of methods that helped alleviate the risk of dark night of the soul, and also what are the methods, just kind of so people have a taste, what is it, the methods that would go into the course? I mean, I know they can go and do it, but just as an example, what's in the protocol? Yeah,
sure. And so the protocol is actually divided up to allow people to sample a wide range of methods, because at least at this time, and we've been working on it for years, there doesn't seem to be a way to actually match people to a specific method. And so it's designed to basically be a trial and error structure that people go through as they go through the program. And sometimes it's divided. I'll talk about the original protocol. Sometimes, rather than the shortened, newer protocol.
Yes.
But sometimes it was, a couple of methods a week, or a couple of changes in what they were doing a week, shall we say. And other times it lasted for an entire week, and they would do a method for an entire week. It's also important to note how long one needed to do methods, right? And so for some of these methods, they were positive psychology-based methods. And so in the early part of the protocol, especially for the first couple of weeks, we would bring in these positive psychology methods, sometimes just a one-off method like a gratitude letter or a eulogy exercise, or basically the things from positive psychology, which is an academic discipline in psychology that deals with just making ordinary people happier, basically. So it's like a non-pathological side of psychology, more of like a thriving side of academic psychology. They've distilled down a handful of things that are basically their gold standard exercises. And so we used a number of those as one-off methods as people began the protocol. And so they would do maybe a couple a week, as an example, during the first 2 weeks of the protocol. They would also begin to do morning and evening exercises, which were also some types of forgiveness and gratitude and exercises like that. Again, everything done in a very specific way, obviously with very precise instructions and all of that. But things like that were also drawn from the leading practices of the positive psychology movement that had really researched how to make things like that work. One of the things about the general self-help movement is that they get almost everything wrong. that they tell people to do, because they're not out there conducting a lot of research on people. I think one of my favorite examples is journaling. We went through this phase where there were all sorts of self-help books telling you to journal, so like journaling makes you happier and all of that, right? And there are academic findings that say journaling makes you happier, but they're very, very precise, right? And so as an example, if you're journaling and you're journaling on a bad experience, and the instructions for your journaling are be very precise about your journaling, just relive the experience, but at a very precise analytical way, right? So you're not just regurgitating or generally reliving or expressing the experience and putting it on paper. As you're thinking back to that experience, you're really carefully analyzing that, right? That actually does make you happier. However, if you happen to get a journaling book that said to just relive the experience, but not get into this intense analytical side of it, and you do that with a negative experience, it makes you less happy, right? And so these types of nuances generally aren't in mainstream books unless they're in the books that are written by the academics who are doing this research, which are few and far between, because academics are punished basically for publishing popular books. I mean, inside the academic world, the only thing that there's a reward for is things like peer review papers and grants. And so you go get grants, which brings in money to the university, and then you write papers based on that increase the academic prestige of the university, and the paper lets you get another grant, and you repeat, and you just keep doing that again and again and again and again, and that's effectively your job. Right? Your job is not to communicate with the public. Your job is not to publish mainstream books, and you're probably going to get penalized in your career if you do that, unless you're like at the end of your career and you're some super senior scientist person who's won every award already and whatever else, then it's sort of okay. So conversely, on the journaling thing, if you have a happy experience and you get journaling instruction that says just really analyze that happy experience, as you're thinking back to it, that actually makes you less happy, right? And if you just generically relive and just sort of recount the details in your journal of a positive experience, that makes you happier. So these positive psychology exercises that we use in the program are equally nuanced. Right. And so when someone hears gratitude exercise or forgiveness exercise or something like that, if they want to start using those things, they really need to find the positive psychology scientists that can provide the very precisely detailed instructions on how to not have that actually make things worse for you. And I just want to stress that right up front, because it's very easy to hear lists of things like what we'll talk about today and not realize that if they're not done in very specific ways, that they can often be bad for you, right? So there's, at the beginning of the program, this instruction around positive psychology, and that's just to make people happier as they're starting the process, which relates to what we said a little bit ago, which is that the happier someone is, the less likely they are to have a dark night of the soul, right? The less likely they are to have a severe, prolonged period of depression come from using some of these more intense methods that come later in the program. So we front load the program with things that are designed and very well scientifically proved to make you happier as a way to adjust for that. We use some like Buddhist type protocols for meditation that are also designed to give you, they're really supposed to transition you, but they don't really transition people so much. But what they do is they give people really good glimpses of fundamental well-being. Probably the most popular expression of these, ours are, modified and all of that, but they're close. The most popular expression of these is that people can go and just do on their own is the Goenka Vipassana movement. We're all over the world. There are like these 10-day retreats. I think they're 10-day retreats, if I remember right. It's been a long time ago. But let's just hypothetically say they're 10-day retreats, and maybe they're 2-week retreats. I don't know. And, you go through a series of things. You're meditating on your breath. You're meditating on the outside surface of your skin. You're just doing all of these different exercises. And you're doing it in there for like 10 or more hours a day, I think, and you're in silence the whole time and whatever else. So we don't do any of that. It's an hour and a half a day or so of practices between the positive psychology stuff and the meditation stuff. And so we did that because that was the most effective thing that we'd ever found that produced glimpses of, fundamental well-being, temporary experiences of fundamental well-being for people. And again, we're looking in that first 6 weeks to mitigate these issues, right? And so make people happier, give them glimpses, and then how do you assure that this predisposition to glimpses is positive glimpses and not negative glimpses? And so we use a group exercise for that. We call it the group awareness exercise. It's also one of those things that appears here and there in various religions and spiritual systems and whatnot around the world. But it's basically like a descriptive exercise, someone describing a certain aspect of the contents of their experience. The thing that's different about this than just doing it on your own is that it's one of the group forms of it. It's one of the social forms of it. And so people are put into small groups and they basically do a round robin process. If you hear people describing, some people in that round robin process describing temporary forms of fundamental well-being, and they're not freaking out, right? They're not having some horrible, scary experience. It basically primes your system to do the same, right? To have a more positive experience. And so it's that cocktail of things, basically, that we were using in the first 6 weeks of the original protocol to try to give people initial positive glimpses and to, to make them happier so that when they arrived at the methods later in the program, even, when people that come into this program are often not that happy, right? In order to do a really, and these things used to last for 4 months, right? In order to do a 4-month protocol with this amount of time commitment and whatnot, you've got to be pretty unhappy. You've got to really want to make a major change, right? And so it became very important to boost those people up at the beginning. So as we were running that first group of 6, we began to notice something towards the end of this first 6 weeks, and that is that at least one of the people, it was somebody who came in very suicidally depressed, really, started to have a downward trend at about the 6-week point in their well-being. And so they'd had a great rise, but it had started to dip, and it hadn't, dipped anywhere near down to where it was when they came into the program. It was still way, it was still good. But that dip in well-being concerned us. And so we decided to take a break from the original 12-week protocol for initially a week, and it became 2 weeks, to just really sort of deal with that person, but keep everybody together and progressing through the methods as a group. And that wound up staying as part of that original protocol. So it went from 6 weeks, it went from 12 weeks to 14 weeks at that point. And it became like a break period in the middle between the 6 weeks. And that wound up being a very good idea because other people had the same response and about the same timing as that person did when we started to allow, dozens of people and more to use the protocol. And so in that period of time, we just basically gave them not a break from practices, but a break to sort of go back to any practice or practices that they had experienced in the program up to that point and find what would sort of elevate their well-being again and get it stabilized before they went into the second sort of more heavy lifting part of the program. Back then, the Finders book wasn't out, and they also were reading, and we had everybody read. Hundreds of people read and commented on that draft of that book. That book is like a collaborative book, frankly, to make sure everybody understood it and whatnot. And so they read the book in like, a Word document, basically, and during that time as well. We also used, during that time, an audio supplement from Dr. Jeffery Martin from Neuroacoustic Research. He had this thing that he created for Deepak Chopra for some event for Deepak years ago called the Shri Yantra, where he basically just looked at and analyzed the methods or the sort of the geometry of the Shri Yantra and turned it into sound. And it turned out that, I was asking him, I knew, he's like the leading guy in the world on all this stuff on sound to alter consciousness. And so I was saying, do you have anything that we could use with our protocol that has transitioned people to fundamental well-being? And this soundtrack had, not quickly, I mean, people would use it for a year or something, but some of the people that used it for a year did in fact transition. And I tell you what, when you listen to it and you're not in fundamental well-being, it can be kind of disturbing and freaky. Like it really does something. And then if you listen to it on the other side of fundamental well-being, you're sort of like, oh, this is really nice. So there's like some sort of audio alignment in that. People can actually just go out to the web and order that. If you, incidentally, anytime you're ordering something like a binaural beats product, do not listen to it on YouTube. Do not get it in any MP3 type of format, because the compression messes stuff up. And so you need to find an original raw format, like a FLAC format or some uncompressed wave format or something like that. And somebody like Jeffrey will always make that available. Generally speaking, these types of people like Jeffrey are like locked into publishing agreements with people. And so they have to, they sort of are, biting their lip over stuff being available in MP4 or MP3 and stuff like that, because they just know it's reduced effectiveness, but they can't do anything about it because they've got these publisher agreements in place, and the publisher is going to do whatever they want with their content. But they still will almost always, if you go to their website, have a version of it that is uncompressed, that is actually as powerful as it can be, that's available. And Jeffrey's no exception to that. Okay, so by this point, we're at the 8-week point. Now, something happened in that first 6 weeks that we didn't quite expect, and that is that group awareness exercise, and also some of the combinations of the things that we were doing. There was another exercise that we put in there for positive psychology that dealt with transforming all of your memories and about people and stuff into love. So that instead of when you thought of somebody that you used to hate, when you thought of them, it would just be the experience of love that would come up. And so this turns out that this cocktail of stuff in the first 6 weeks of the program actually wound up transitioning a very sizable number of people. Roughly about half of the people that were in the program would transition off of this cocktail of positive psychology methods, and these methods that were really just designed to get people ready for the real, quote unquote, real methods in the second part of the program. And then the real methods in the second part of the program would pick up like another 10 or 15% of people. And so it's sort of a funny thing that happened there. But those methods that were in the second part of the program would then often deepen people.
Yes.
They would move them further into fundamental well-being and things like that. And we would look at the statistics, week by week, session by session, basically, to see where people were at. And so that's how we know things like that. And it's just very consistent over time with the protocol. We can to the point where if it's 40 people out of the first half of the program, you start asking yourself, okay, what have we screwed up, or what's gone wrong in the first part, just because the numbers are just so reliable. And then you discover, oh crap, these videos weren't available for some reason, and nobody would do it, of course, or whatever. So the second half of the protocol was actually the things that were derived from the early part of the research.
I just want to ask 1 second, Jeffrey. I just want, because this is amazing, but I also want to ask maybe an aside question, which is, there seems, so first of all, just to say for myself, like I was someone, I've done it, and GAE was just, really did it for me, and was, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But the more interesting question is just that comment you made there about kind of percentages and really tracking. And I also remember in the program, filling out every week. And I guess the question I have is, why does this seem so novel? I guess it seems like, I know that some people will be a bit kind of react. I don't know. I can imagine certain people listening and being like, oh my God, it's like, it's scientism. But I don't feel it's that, because I feel that you're very committed to the underlying thing, and that these experiences transcend. It's not like we're reducing them to some kind of putting them in a box, but it's more like using these tools of inquiry, of empirical research. Like that point you just made there, which was like, oh, I can track the percentage, and if it's off, that's kind of telling me something and actually useful. And to give an example, I talked to people who run quite large retreats, Buddhist retreats recently, It's like when all the years, like you've had like, I don't know, probably tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people over decades have come. And do you have any data you've ever collected on just like, you just ask people to do a short survey before they arrive and after they arrive on even their well-being, let alone, and what they did or what really worked for them or anything. So I guess that's my question, which is more broadly, do you think there's an opportunity for more of this kind of data collection of this kind? And why is it other people, or do you know of other people who do that, and why, or what gets in the way of it being done? Those are maybe three questions there. So, do you think there's an opportunity to do more? Do you know people who are doing more of that empirical approach? And what gets in the way of people doing it in this kind of area?
That's a great question. There's obviously massive opportunity to do it. We think people are crazy for not doing it. Lots of times things aren't measured because people don't want to know the answer. And so I won't say who it was, but there was a very large, famous company that implemented a mindfulness program. And those people worked overtime. It was a very data-driven company. And those people worked overtime to ensure that there was no data collection on that program. And it's basically because they didn't think it would show anything, and they thought the program would get killed off. And they wanted it to continue. They wanted people to learn mindfulness. They wanted people to. So sometimes it really is that simple. People just aren't confident in the results, and we have an open policy of researching other people and other people's classes and their protocols and their programs and all of that, and almost no one lets us do that. And the reason is just because they're sure that it's not really doing much in many cases. We were in the very early days of the research, before we had a lot of research subjects, we would ask everybody who was, we were dealing with a lot of teachers and stuff like that initially, because the inclusion criteria was very strict back then. You had to have a community you had to be in a religious tradition or a spiritual tradition that had a very clear definition of some type of non-symbolic experience, persistent non-symbolic experience, or fundamental well-being. You had to have the people, you had to have people that basically validated that you met those criteria, and so on, right, in order to be one of our participants. And so you better believe we asked, they were out, they wind up being teachers mostly, right? And so you better believe we asked every single one of them for more participants, right? Like, who have you taught? Who is, in your sphere of outreach and instruction and whatnot that you feel would make a good subject? And we almost never got anybody. So I think that there's this kind of assumption.
What about evaluating their programs? I mean, have you ever, that's my other thought, is just asking people if you could evaluate, but that's been also rare, you're saying, is, but you're open to it.
Of course. And we have done it where people let us do it, for sure. And, obviously we would be asked to come and often meet with people at their events or around the time of their events or things like that, especially foreigners, that were like coming in, traveling into America. We would do our interviews when they were in the country whenever possible, just to save money, basically, back then, and of having to fly halfway around the world for some one-day interview and have it cost $5,000 to do that interview or something, right? And so we were around for these events, and of course, we were doing unofficial data collection. Right. And so, we would be with with the people, we'd be going out to lunch with them. We'd be seeing them at the mixers in the evenings, oftentimes, and stuff like that. And so we were constantly collecting data on the people who were at a given event, even if it wasn't a formal research endeavor. So we did a lot of that. And that's how we also knew that they were kind of smart not to let us do it, because, they probably wouldn't have wanted those results put out there from a business standpoint or whatever, right? But then some people were like, please come and do it. Or some people were just like, you totally have my approval to, while you're at the event, you totally have my approval to just talk to whoever you want and conduct, whatever research you want you can't do it during the event. I don't want my people distracted from the things that I'm having them do or anything like that. And some of them would announce it from the front of the room. We did a Christian mystic named John Crowder this way as an example. And he, right on the first day, right up front, he's like, has me stand up in the crowd and he points to me and he says, basically, this guy is here doing this research from this university, go talk to him. And that was really helpful, so it was a whole mix of different things. And, Crowder's crowd, I thought, was extraordinary, frankly. Crowder had a lot of people in fundamental well-being in his crowd. Whatever he was doing from his Christian mystic perspective, it was powerful. I think a lot of it related to someone's confidence. Rick Wyman from Vortex Healing was fine with us, hanging around his events. And, they were often small enough that you could basically just talk to everybody at breakfast and lunch and dinner, at the hotel where they were all sequestered, and all of that, and get a good feel for it. And, we were able to see that by a certain class that he represented, people would be in fundamental well-being. And by and large, people were in fundamental well-being by that class. We differed with him on some of his views. Like he said that it would happen in this one class. And when we were talking to people and interviewing them, it had often happened in earlier classes, but so what, right? It's a very effective method for we only found one person in the class that we went and researched that was the one that was supposed to transition you that wasn't transitioned. That's an incredible success rate, right? Now, these people have been working on this stuff for years. They've been taking classes for years by that point, and all that. But nonetheless, that's a very high success rate. And so, we do find people out there like that and that are open to allowing us to research. The other research that's done by other researchers is very sporadic and it's very small. It's oftentimes done for graduate student work. Maybe they've got a student that's doing a master's degree in something related to transpersonal psychology or something, and they'll go out and they'll research some group in some usually those are healing related, but they'll scoop in some fundamental well-being oftentimes as part of it. Or you'll have somebody that's doing a PhD in a program like that, and they'll go out and they'll do, 5 or 6 people, or sometimes just 1 or 3 people or something like that. And so the research is really very sporadic that's out there largely. We're the first really sort of systematic. Large scale effort.
I mean, even just, I don't want to go on about the having this kind of more phenomenological description of fundamental well-being. I mean, that's what I want to so just to come back to the protocol then, is there one example of a method from the second half of the course? I don't want to go into detail. I really want to emphasize, I think, to listeners, and you're emphasizing that it's quite important that you do this through the protocol, and that there's quite a lot of thought that's going into this and the setup. But just one example, just so people have a flavor of what was in it that you'd found from your original interviews. Like, what's one example of a practice in the second half?
Sure. I actually think it's an interesting mix of things, and so like Headless Way is basically leads off the second half of the program. That's a free thing that they can go out and look up and do today if somebody really wants to. I don't want to talk more about that or what's interesting about that because there's kind of a spoiler that will prevent it from working if I do. And so people just need to go try it and experience it and see if it works for them. But the interesting thing, for instance, about that protocol and that method, and it's a variety of different methods, put out these days, maintained by a guy named Richard Lang, who's not the originator of that method. That was originated by someone else, 50 or 60 years ago now. It's modern, it's new, and it's nothing like a lot of the other meditations and stuff that are out there, but it transitions quite a few people. And what happens is you have these people that come to the research that have been diligent students of some sort of like Buddhist tradition or Hindu tradition or Christian tradition or whatever it is forever, and had like very little luck with that, right? And they're really proud oftentimes of their background and how hard they've studied and what an expert they are in this or that tradition or whatever else. And then, it's Headless Way, this really simple, quirky, bizarre little technique that winds up transitioning them after all that work, right? And they almost hate that because they don't like they want to be like talking about how they learned all this stuff and they're this expert in whatever system they're an expert in, right? And they don't want to be like, oh, but that was all, it was actually this bizarre, quirky little method called headless wave that transitioned me. So it's so funny because people always have a psychological resistance to having had it be the thing that worked for them. So there's that. And then, we use some aspects in the week after that of a method that comes from Australia, a guy in Australia. His name is Richard, and he has this thing called actual freedom. And it's kind of a broad, confusing method to try to use in his system. But for us, we began to become aware many years ago when his method really first started working for people, that this was a method that transitioned people further in fundamental well-being than any other thing that we knew of. Now, you more or less had to be in fundamental well-being for it to do that. But if you were in fundamental well-being, this was like an incredible method for that. It also would transition people slightly earlier. But his group is kind of less interested in that. They're interested in the more further thing. And so we basically just looked at that method, tried to figure out which part of it was really sort of working the magic, and if we could tweak it in any way to, make it more effective. And then that became the next method in the program. And then the program after that is a mantra-based method.
One question, just if I can come in, just to ask you. It's really interesting you say, oh, you came across it. How, so this group, how, I actually remember looking it up and then coming, I think Daniel Ingram, people had come across it, but how did you, like, it's quite a new thing. I mean, I remember reading it, like, how did you come across it? Was this from your early interviews and there were some people who mentioned it, or how did you come across new methods, I guess I'm asking?
Yeah, we have, I don't know, an unprecedented network of people in fundamental well-being that are part of the research. And so we're just always hearing about stuff. People are always recommending that we look into something because they think that maybe they're in a group where it's having some success. Or, I mean, that's how we found vortex healing, as an example. So sometimes I'll just be doing events and random people will come up to me. So in this case, we were doing some research on some late location people. We were trying to sort of fill out our knowledge. We'll probably get into these terms later. I don't remember if we did earlier in the last thing or not, but we were trying to fill out our knowledge about location 4, really. And it turns out that there was a handful of people at this point that had this method be successful to transition to location 4. And you just really didn't, when you ask people, hey, what worked for you to get to location 4? The answer was usually, I have no idea. And so to have, a sample of people say, well, it was this that did it for me, that made that very interesting for us to go and look into. So yeah, it was just part of our normal research with finders.
I think that's actually a really great point to come actually to the locations. People have heard you maybe mention it now briefly. And so to step back, I think one of the first breakthroughs was starting to look at these phenomenological markers, compared to previous research efforts looking at what could be called transpersonal psychology or fundamental well-being, something that's more than just kind of the positive, something that's kind of transcendent, or self-transcendence, or in the Maslow hierarchy. That was the first thing, was these phenomenological markers. What was it like for memory? What was it like for your emotions? I remember you describing that as a breakthrough. I think that's a very good point. And then what I'm hearing, and I'm going to I know it a little bit, but I'm kind of leading you in, is to ask you, so you start to have this kind of map, is that what you talk about, these locations? Could you tell us a bit about what you mean by locations in fundamental well-being, and more generally, like the Martin matrix? Maybe this is a moment to start talking a little bit about that.
Sure, absolutely. So what happened was, out of the early interviews, what we were really trying to do was sort people for neurological work later. Sort them for fMRI experiments, sort them for EEG experiments, things like that. And oftentimes what you have to do is figure out how you're going to conduct an experiment. It's not like you just put somebody in a brain scanner and take pictures of their brain and all this magical data flows out that you can just make sense of. You've got to have very precise experiments based on very specific hypotheses in order to be able to test and, see what might be going on and things like that. And in a novel area like this, where virtually no work had been done before us, in a comprehensive way, outside of, like the TM tradition had a ton of research, right, on transcendental meditation, right? But nobody had really gone across a bunch of traditions before. And so we were sort of left at ground zero starting that type of project. And what you do is you start by just beginning simple data collection. So surveys and interviews and cognitive science-based interviews, what's changed in memory, what's changed in thoughts and thinking, what's changed in emotion, what's changed in perception, things like that. You're just like, okay, there are these different, broad things that happen in the brain. Let's start trying to figure out where there might be some changes. And then from there, be able to figure out how we might test those changes to see, what is actually happening in the nervous system and so on. And so what came out of that actually was pretty useful, maybe the most useful thing that we have come up with aside from the protocol for people that want to transition to it. But if people don't want to transition, the protocol doesn't matter that much. So the other thing that's very useful is just this map, essentially, of these different types of fundamental well-being that emerged from all of that early research, a psychological map, essentially a cognitive science-based psychological map. And what we began to notice is that people's self-reports began to cluster together into different buckets. Initially, we called them buckets, not locations, because this person would be in this bucket, this person would be in this other bucket, that type of thing. And so when we started to talk about it publicly, we had to stop using the word buckets, which we were, no kidding, we're just using internally for a very long time. And we're like, oh crap, what are we going to call it when we talk to other people about this? And one of the things that we'd seen is that most of these spiritual systems and religious systems and stuff like that, they had hierarchical layers. And so it's like, this was the lower point, and then this was like where you progressed to next, and then you were supposed to progress to here, and then you were supposed to progress up even more, and then it was like a progressive series of things. And our data did not suggest that that was the way that this should really be optimally viewed. We didn't feel, not that there weren't progressions in it, certainly there were progressions in it that we can talk about in a minute, but that like everyone shouldn't necessarily be progressing. That's not really what's ideal for everyone's life. It's possible that, like, let's say that there's like 4 stages or something, right? It's possible that like stage 2 is the optimum point for most of humanity, right? And so if you have a system that's trying to push you to stage 3 and stage 4, that can be problematic potentially just for living your life, and going to work and stuff like that. And we didn't want to be seen as advocating a progression like that, or validating progressions like that. We've kind of felt like wherever you land in fundamental well-being, that's great. Some things are great for some lives, some things are great for other lives, but it's important to have those sort of nuances. And so we wound up with the word locations along a related continuum of experience. And so we have this continuum, and on it is location 1 and location 2 and location 3 and location 4. Also notice it's not designed, for any sort of book sales or anything like that, right? You're not the alchemist at location 1, right? Or something sexy that people want to identify with. And, oh, what are you? Oh, you're the wizard. Oh, wow. Well, I'm just the alchemist, but I want to be the wizard someday, or, stuff like people do, right? Or, oh, yeah, you're purple. Oh, I'm still red. I hope one day to become green and maybe someday purple and maybe even translucent, right? And so there's all these sort of psychological things that are priming people and making people feel better about themselves or worse about themselves based on where they are, allowing judgments to be made about, oh, look at how that group, they're so low, they're just red, they're so primitive compared to us, and, things like that. We just didn't want to contribute to anything remotely like that. And so we said it's a continuum of related experiences, and a continuum is a number line. It goes this way, right? It doesn't go up and down. So it's a continuum that goes across, basically. And it goes from certainly more basic versions of the experience on the left side to more, out there experiences on the right side. That's where that naming convention comes from. And then we started off with these locations and talking publicly about these locations because as far as we could tell, nobody had ever heard of them. Nobody had a frame of reference for them. We knew all these groups all around the world. And what was clear to us is that they all had ranges of this continuum that they considered acceptable. So for instance, if you're a Christian mystic, location 3 is the acceptable form of non-symbolic experience of, fundamental well-being. If you're in location 2, you're not right with God. So if you're in location 4, you're not right with God, right?
What does location 3 look like, just to give people a flavor for people listening?
Sure.
What are
Yeah,
these
so it's it
just to,
often has a divine flavor to it. It doesn't have to, but it can have like it can also have a panpsychist flavor depending upon someone. But it often has a divine flavor associated with it. There's a sense of union with that divine presence. It's sort of all pervading divinity, if you will. So there's a sense of continual, ever increasing sort of union or merger with it. You never become one with it because you can't be God, right? God is apart from this world and, the Abrahamic traditions and whatnot, right? And so, but you are increasingly merging with it, right? Dissolving into it and, blah, blah, right? It has a single meta emotion. There isn't an expression of personal emotion. Emotion can feel divine. It's non-personal either way. It can feel panpsychic, sort of an impersonal emotion, but it often feels like a divine emotion. And it feels like a combination of love and joy and compassion, things like that. With any given time, one of those more forward, you might be feeling more the love component of it, but the other components are still there. There can be additional components of it as well, based on someone's kind of programming from their religious system or their culture or whatever else, but it's always going to have love and joy and compassion in those components. And it's like a divine, amazing, it's like, it's really like the peak human experience. It's easy to see why people latched onto it and enshrined it. It tops out everything, when we do when we do a bunch of measures across all kinds of things like, gratitude and stuff like that. If you're in location 3, more or less, you're at the apex of all of those types of things, all of those very sort of positive human experience type things.
And what I'm trying to get is just for people listening, there's 2 things really that are very useful. So one is you saying this, when you looked at these different factors that were showing up, whether it's about emotion or about cognition, there were kind of buckets. So just to recap your term, I know that was original, but I think it's useful to say it wasn't like just people were all over the map. If you thought there were like 3 dimensions or even 2 dimensions, it wasn't like we just had every people. There were kind of clusterings or buckets, which we now going to call locations. And your second point, which is a bit like a normal map, that when you look at a globe or even look at a map, there isn't like necessarily a better or worse place. There are different locations. Now it's true, the way I sometimes thought it was like, if I'm at least traveling by land to go, I don't know, from England to Italy, I often will go through France, but I could fly, kind of metaphorically. Right. So there's this also this value that there is some kind of sequencing in the sense that your locations are labeled like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Which suggests some kind of sequencing. But the point is you can jump. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It's more like there are countries maybe ever further afield, and often to have got to go to further countries, you will likely have gone to some nearer countries. That's what I'm getting. And so and you just described there for listeners is you're saying in this, for example, in location 3, things, there's a kind of cluster of feeling, this sense of union with the divine or something bigger than yourself, this presence. There is emotion versus maybe other locations where there's no emotion. The emotion is generally a positive love or compassion or gratitude, etc. I'm just getting at what you mean by these buckets is this kind of clustering of both way of perceiving the world, the emotional landscape, the way your cognition is working, your sense of self, and things like that. That's and to give an example, I guess like location 1, which is the first one, is gonna have less of those things maybe, but also just be different in your sense of self. And what I'm hearing is you're saying is what you started to notice, your initial work was starting to find this map. And why, I guess a question I'd ask in a moment is, why is the map useful, do you think? And secondly, maybe you could talk a bit about how the map became the matrix as a second point. So first, why is it useful?
Yeah, sure. The map is useful because it's very helpful to know where you're at in fundamental well-being. So for instance, locations 1 and 2, in location 1, when you transition to location 1, what basically happens is your survival system gets rewired, right? And so the distinction between a finder and a non-finder begins at location 1. And a non-finder is kind of got a constant process running in the background, as all animals do, where you have a sense that somehow in this moment things are not okay. Something might not be okay. And your system is kind of looking for it. It's on the lookout for it. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the ceiling could fall in, any number of things could happen. It's proactive on the part of our nervous system to be able to, have that experience. However, it's not really in sync with modern life. I mean, the odds of, when was the last time you were in a building that the ceiling fell in? Right? I've never been in the building where the ceiling fell in, right? I'm like, 52 years old now. I like to think that my dad lived his entire life until his 80s, late 80s, and he never had a ceiling fall in, right? And so generally speaking, we're living very safe lives. We're not in a Brazilian rainforest with all kinds of stuff trying to kill us. Fundamental well-being, maybe not such a good idea in that situation, right? But for us, we really live very privileged lives, and we live very safe lives fundamentally. And so we don't need the wiring from, 10, 20, 30,000 years ago, like a bird does, or every other animal does, because we're not living under constant threat. We've managed to more or less subjugate all of the other animals. And, nothing's going to run in here and rip my arm off while I'm talking to you or anything like that. I'm in a safe country. I'm in a safe place. There's not going to be gunfire that comes through the window. So there's a transition that happens with fundamental well-being around that type of safety and survival system, from a sense that things are fundamentally may not be okay. Not that they aren't okay, but that they may not be okay in this moment. And what that produces for people, which is often a background sense of worry or anxiety, things like that, that then sits at the foundation of their nervous system. And everything else is kind of built up on top of that, unless you have normal, egoic, for lack of a better word, human culture, which is, as we know, not, amazing in many ways. We're all-time leading, time in terms of poverty reduction and all sorts of great things about our current situation, but plenty of things that also seem pretty messed up too, right? Not ideal, unless you happen to be like one of us living, as one of the top 5% richest people in the world, even if we're like the poorest people in our countries or whatever, right? And so realistically, what changes is a sense comes in that things are fundamentally okay in location 1. And your experience of the world is built up on top of that, not in an unrealistic way, and not in a way that immediately transforms all of your emotional experience to be positive or anything like that. In location 1, you still have a mix of positive and negative emotions. You can still get triggered. You can still get severely triggered. If your spouse comes home and says, I'm divorcing you and I'm taking everything, of course, there's going to be an emotional expression in your system from that. And you're going to be, able to effectively deal with that and whatnot. But if you pause and look down deep, paradoxically, somehow at that same moment, there will be a sense that everything is fine. Doesn't make any sense. The sky is falling in your world. And yet somehow deep down, your experience is built on the sky is not really falling. Everything is okay.
And how does that, and how does knowing this, that's the question, I guess, for me, the location then. So that's like location 1, and generally throughout, how does helping know the locations, how's that beneficial then, I guess, is my question. Why is it useful to know that?
It's not a great idea to run a business in location 3. You can really, really run an effective business in location 1. So if your life is as an entrepreneur, you were reading, I think, my bio earlier a little bit, just a brief covering of what I've done. I've done a lot of entrepreneurship, right? Thank God I didn't transition into location 3 and just start trying to do entrepreneurship from there, because having an experience of union with the divine, having, this all-pervasive divine love for everyone and everything, that doesn't make you the best steward of your company's resources. Right?
Have you seen that? Have you seen that happen?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've had plenty of people in the research that's discussed that versus, location 1 or location 2. Location 2 is probably the best place to run something like that from, as an example, right? And so knowing the map and knowing your life, are you going to live alone? Are you going to live with a partner? Are you going to have children? Are you not going to have children? There are consequences to practical real life decisions. Fundamental well-being is just one aspect of our life. You know, oftentimes people who are religious or spiritual about it, it's like the penultimate thing that everything gets wrapped around. But we view it as just another component of life that has to integrate in with the other aspects of your life. And if that includes going to work and going to a job, probably a good idea not to be out at location 4 unless you've really carefully selected that job for location 4, right? If that includes having certain kinds of relationships in your life, it's probably better done from certain locations instead of other locations. And so it's very useful just from a practical standpoint. It's also useful to help people clarify where they're at. You know, there's all sorts of teachers out there that are talking about their experience of fundamental well-being, even in specific traditions. You know, like I remember we made a pass through the Theravada community, which is a sub-discipline of Buddhism a number of years ago, many, many years ago now. And they have a very structured map. They have like the arising and passing away and stream entry and first path and second path and third path. It was a complex map of enlightenment, right, in their world. And their fundamental well-being is enlightenment, right? You work your way to be an arhat, which is an enlightened person, and all of that. And I would, you know, sit in front of a teacher one day and get their information and stuff, and we'd be done. And I'd be like, okay, now can you tell me for your students, phenomenologically, what is it a student has to report to you that you look for you to say, they have experienced the arising and passing away, or they have experienced stream entry, or whatever, right? There's a bunch of these. And then I would ask a different, again, often highly regarded Theravada teacher the next day, and they would have totally different answers for these things. You know, like one person's phenomenological descriptions of the arising and passing away was like another person's stream entry phenomenological descriptions, right? And so they're all deriving this authority from these thousands of year-old texts and stuff like that. But, you know, we can't understand really something written 150 years ago in America in English as an English-speaking American, right? The culture was just so different back then, and we're not situated in that culture. And even though it's the same language and it's technically the same country and it's technically the same people, you know, any period historian, you know, they write their dissertation, you know, to get their PhD, translating some aspect of something from 150 years ago that was written into modern understanding, right? It's that you can literally, it's like new knowledge for our contemporary world. You know, that's the requirement of a PhD, like some great breakthrough, amazing new knowledge that has been, you know, afforded to society, right? And so if that's the case, how can you really expect to get a lot of precision out of something written in a language that isn't yours, maybe is not even a common language anymore, from many thousands of years ago, that may or may not have even come to modern times in an accurate original format, whatever else, right? And so what we learned is that you basically have all of these, you know, differences even within a given tradition. Some people like vortex healing, it's newer. You know, someone like Rick can be very specific with the teachers that he anoints, and he can work with them very precisely, and he can keep everything very tight, right? But for something like Theravada Buddhism that came on the scene a really long time ago, that's impossible. And so one of the things that the map helps with is, because it's drawn from actual living human experience, if one teacher is talking about one thing and another teacher is talking, calling it the same thing, but describing it something different, you have like an independent framework that you can be slotting these people and what they're talking about into. And that helps, if you're sort of a student of this, it helps bring a tremendous clarity to really everyone that you're ever going to listen talk about this stuff. And for that, we do have to make the transition from continuum to matrix, because the teachers themselves, really, people do not know about the continuum. That's why we put the continuum up first, and that we made sure that was the only thing that we put out for a number of years, because we wanted to give it time to sort of permeate the interested people sort of space before we talked about the other axis of the matrix, which is basically depth.
The depth. And so, because today I think we've actually hit our time, that is going to be episode 3, I think, is going to be covering how the layers interact with the locations to become the matrix. which I
Sounds
think
great.
is a really great topic for next time. I mean, I just want to say, I think, first of all, again, thank you. I look forward to our next episode. Is there anything you want to say that you want to end with for today at this moment, and with this great trailer for what we're going to cover next? I think that point I just want to emphasize at the very end, which is this point that I suppose what could seem intellectual, like having this map, which actually, by the way, many traditional religions have. They have their stages or their thing, is phenomenally helpful, I think, in this sense. And the way I think of it a little bit for myself is a bit like healthcare, medicine of the body. If we have no model, even, and it's not the truth, but we don't have a map or some relatively useful understanding of the body, we're going to have a lot of difficulty treating it and on understanding, oh, you're at this moment, in your disease, so we should do that, or you're in this moment of your healing process, so it's time for you to practice walking, if you're recovering from a stroke, versus do this other thing. And I feel that is really valuable, and I would echo that. I found it phenomenally useful to suddenly make sense of things, and with this grounding back into very empirically verifiable for yourself inner phenomenological experience. Oh, I'm having these kind of feelings, or this experience of myself. That, I think, is also the markings are very clear in that regard, and very in a way neutral. And so I want to say that's, I think, a phenomenally important point, again, of this map, and it's the best map that I have seen. For my part, I would say, just for listeners, I would certainly say it's the best map I have seen of this kind of thing, for my part. So I want to thank you, Jeffrey. I really look forward to our next episode. Is there anything else you'd like to say before signing off today?
No, I think that's great. If people want more information, they can go to the research site, nonsymbolic.org.
And your personal website, yeah, Dr. Jeffery Martin. Thank you. I'll put all the links up in the episode notes. Please follow along on the Life Itself podcast, which you can find on all major platforms on our website. Until next time.
Thanks so much.